Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for well over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Pepe Rossy. He's a local co-founder of an organization called Albany Cuba Solidarity. Thank you for being here today, Pepe.
Thank you, Trudy. We're very grateful that you had us here today.
Good. Well, let's start right in. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's talk about, I know that you're a really well-known activist in the community and that you're doing great work. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you became an activist.
Yes, I grew up in Puerto Rico. I entered and finished high school very young. I was 16 when I entered the University of Puerto Rico. And I grew up in this very conservative, very devoutly Catholic family. And it was something about being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Meaning I was as a university freshman, I was entering the campus one day when I did not know that there was a rally of pro-independence supporters. And I'm just walking. I had nothing to do with that. I knew about the independence movement. When I see the police charging the students and beating up the students, and I literally had to run, even though I had nothing to do with that, because otherwise the police would have caught me and beat me up too. So that was an experience roughly 2 weeks into my first semester. But more importantly, when I went home and I saw the media story about that, it talked about how the students attacked the police and were throwing rocks at the police and how they assaulted the police. And I began to realize then how the media lies, something that for me was novel, a novel idea. And I became a more critical consumer of media. I began to look at some of the history I had learned in school and to realize it wasn't just the media that lied. I learned that some of the books that I had read had lied, that the United States had very deliberately kept the very last position that the President of the United States appointed in Puerto Rico was not the governor, was the Secretary of Education. A Secretary of Education who landed in Puerto Rico knowing very little about our country, who wrote the text of history that I had studied a few years earlier, again knowing very little, but a book that was very ideologically constructed to give us an idea about how we needed the United States, how our independence movement would never now amount to anything, how the leaders of that movement, literally, there's a chapter called, where they calls them demented, and it was a process of beginning to discover a system of lies that I had grown up in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well I can see that where that would have radicalized you.
It did. It was also a moment of much political effervescence. This is 1967.
Oh, right.
And so we know what was going on around the world. And I was recently in Cuba, and on the way we stopped in Mexico. And one of the places I visited in Mexico was the site of the Tlatelolco massacre of 1968. And I get goosebumps as I talk about that, because these were very exciting years and very scary years sometimes. Because we were very much in tune with what was happening in Paris, with what was happening in Mexico, what was happening in Buenos Aires, what was happening in Berkeley. And we felt we were part of this international youth movement. And so yes, that's how I began to inquire, began to read, began to learn. A whole different story of the one that I've been told before.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Albany Cuba Solidarity Committee. You're one of the co-founders of this organization. When was it founded, and why did you think it was necessary to found such an organization?
I don't know exactly when it was founded. I think it must have been about 6 years ago.
Okay.
And the person that brought us together is an amazing woman. I know you know her, Mabel Leon, who is one of the pillars of activism in the Capital Region.
Yes.
I won't say her age, but she's been around. She's been a member of Grannies for Peace, and she has so much more energy and a great brain to put that energy to good use. So she's been active in many causes, but Cuba has been a very dear cause a cause very dear to her heart. And for many years, Mabel had almost single-handedly been organizing this campaign of every summer, Pastors for Peace, since several bus routes that start in Canada and they travel throughout the United States, visiting dozens of cities in Canada, the United States. And what they do is they have political events and they talk about Cuba, but they also gather donations of medical supplies, of humanitarian assistance, and they put them in these school buses that are very colorfully painted, and they travel through Mexico in defiance of the blockade of the United States on Cuba. They've been detained, they've been imprisoned, they've had the goods that they have gathered confiscated, and they continue to defy the embargo, which many of us call the blockade. It's basically the same thing, just different names. And so Mabel had been organizing this for years. I had attended a couple, and about 6 years ago, some of us felt that we really need to do more than just this annual event, and that's how we were born. We gathered at the Friends Meeting House, and we invited many people. I consulted with several activists from the Capital Region to pick their brain about do's and don'ts and where to go, and got pretty good advice, and so we've been going and growing since then. We've held about an activity a month for pretty much the past 3 years. Sometimes a film, sometimes a round table. We've brought speakers, we've had outdoor rallies, and most recently, as you know, we organized a trip to Cuba. This was a people-to-people delegation of 20 activists from different walks of life, activists from the activists against mass incarceration, activists of Grannies for Peace, of labor. We had several labor activists, we had several teachers, several musicians. It was a very diverse group, and so that was one of our more recent events, and a wonderful one where we really spent 2 weeks traveling. We traveled over 400 miles around Cuba through 8 provinces, staying with people, with ordinary Cubans, not in hotels, and attended many amazing lectures, learning a whole lot. It's a wonderful experience.
All right, well, we'll talk more about that in a minute. You mentioned the embargo. I think some of our listeners might not even know what the embargo is. Could you just briefly talk a little bit about the embargo and how you found out about it and why you care?
Sure. Well, Cuba, like Puerto Rico, Cuba and Puerto Rico have had a very close history. Back in the 19th century, we dreamt of, our patriots dreamt of making it one nation. And so there's a very popular poem in Cuba and Puerto Rico talks of Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of the same bird. So as I entered the University of Puerto Rico, that was one of those causes that I learned. And I became active in support of the Cuban Revolution, which took place in 1959. But up until 1959, Cuba, like Puerto Rico, had been a colony of the United States, pretty much. Puerto Rico, more formally, Puerto Rico, according to the Supreme Court, belongs to, but is not a part of, the United States. Cuba supposedly was a republic, but a republic in name only. The United States government, the CIA, would install and remove governments, would promote coups, would support dictators, and it was so for all practical purposes, it was a colony of the United States. It was a very corrupt institution. It was, they call it the playground of the Caribbean. Some of us have seen The Godfather. That reminds us of how the mafia, how organized crime had taken over the casino industry in Cuba. Many of the great, the well-known names of organized crime, Mario Lansky, I can't think of the other names, but they're very familiar names, were the owners of some of the casinos, and they would literally bring a suitcase of $100,000 every night to the dictator of turn at that time. Prior to the revolution, it was Batista. But of course, this meant the people of Cuba were very dispossessed. There was widespread poverty and suffering, particularly away from La Habana. There was one of several revolutionary movements. There have been attempts for insurrection in Cuba throughout the 20th century at different times. And one of these was what is known as the July 26 movement. And they launched a guerrilla war that started in 1956 and gradually went on taking terrain, even though the United States went on supporting the Batista regime and providing them state-of-the-art weapons. They went on taking land until they finally toppled the Batista government in 1959, January 1st, 1959. And what is important to understand is that from the beginning, the United States was undermining the Cuban Revolution, that there were attempts to kill the leaders of the Cuban Revolution prior to and ever since the triumph of the revolution. There's an author that wrote a book, I believe it was called 636 Ways to Kill Fidel. And by the time they turned that book into a film, it was 639 ways to kill Fidel. So that there's been a hostile policy from the part of the United States, attempts to topple the revolutionary government. It was revolutionary because from the beginning, it tried to redress many of the grievances of the people. So one of the first measures by the revolutionary government was an agrarian reform. That they were, it was something like 85% of the land of Cuba was controlled by American corporations, including perhaps the most famous one, the United Fruit Company. And so one of the first acts of the revolution was to give land to the landless peasants. And to do so, there was a law passed a few months into the revolution, and they would confiscate, the government would confiscate land, anything in excess of, I believe it was like 1,000 acres, with compensation to the former owners of those lands. But the United States did not like it. The owners of United Fruit Company and some of the other companies did not like it. And they were so powerful at the time. The Secretary of State and the director of the CIA, the Dulles brothers, they were in the board of directors of United Fruit Company. So they did not like it, even though the government gave compensation and they also compensated Canadian and European companies. The American companies did not like it because the compensation was based on the amount of the value that they had declared for tax purposes. That was the value of the land. So of course they had been underpaying their taxes for many years by understating the value of their land, and when they were paid what was the stated value,
worth, right.
They were not happy with that. And of course, you know, the director of the CIA and the Secretary of State were, as you can guess, pretty powerful. So very early on, the United States implemented an embargo. A policy of a series of policies that began to be incrementally more draconian. The first one had to do with reducing the import of Cuban sugar into the United States, and Cuba responded to that by confiscating even smaller plots of land. I believe something like 800 acres. Anything above. Anything larger than 800 acres, and that was followed by an embargo on oil, on American oil to Cuba, which could have paralyzed the country. And at the time, the Soviet Union provided oil to Cuba, and the United States decreed that the United States refineries in Cuba, there were only U.S. refineries in Cuba, could not refine the Soviet oil, and so the Cuban government nationalized the refineries, and so there was a series of steps. That's when President Eisenhower, really imposed the embargo that has stayed pretty much the way the way it is till the present. People think that Obama eliminated the embargo. Not so. The embargo has been codified into law by Congress, and only Congress can undo the embargo. And it's very draconian. It actually not just does it not allow American companies to trade with Cuba, but it does not allow Canadian companies, European companies, South American companies to trade with Cuba, and they're subject to sanctions by the United States government if they do. This is what's called the extraterritorial provisions of what is now the Helms-Burton Law. Something that Mexico, for instance, passed a law making it illegal to comply with the U.S. embargo on Cuba for Mexican companies. The European Union, our strongest ally perhaps, and Canada, our strongest ally, have done the same with regards to the embargo. And this is one of the factors that led Obama to try to make some changes now, because it has isolated the United States, that its strongest allies have condemned the United States. The most recent vote in the United Nations was every nation in the world except the United States and Israel condemned the embargo on Cuba. I believe the vote was something like 191 nations against the embargo to 2. So the United States has gradually been isolated. While the embargo meant to isolate Cuba, every other nation on earth trades with Cuba, even Israel, that supported the U.S. resolution, trades with Cuba.
Okay, well, let's move along. Let's talk a little bit about your trip to Cuba. You visited Cuba in January into February of 2016. Could you see the effects that the embargo had on the Cuban people, and could you talk a little bit about the effects that you did see?
Sure. Yes, I traveled to Cuba a number of times over the years, and so you notice the effects of the embargo. 2 people from our trip fell ill while we were there, and so we had a chance to know firsthand the excellent healthcare system of Cuba. One in a rural town, and another one in La Habana. And so some of the medications that they would have been able to get if they lived in the United States were not available in Cuba. Everything in Cuba is more expensive because if Canada, for instance, as it does, brings grain, wheat, let's say, to Cuba in Canadian ships, those Canadian ships are not allowed to enter a United States port for 6 months. They're barred from entering the United States port, so that it becomes more expensive, much more expensive, for those Canadian or for the Argentinian or for the French or the English, the British companies that trade with Cuba. It becomes more expensive, and so everything is much more expensive in Cuba. And there are things that are simply just not available. Everything from, I mentioned medications, but also the edibles, clothes, everything is much more expensive, and so it is responsible for for much hardship in Cuba.
Okay, well, we actually only have less than 10 minutes, so we'll move right along here. Could you talk a little bit about what the people are like in Cuba? What are the youth like? Do they all have a smartphone, or do they get on the internet when they get home from school? Just briefly, could you tell us a little bit about the people?
Sure. Well, it's a very well-educated country, as you know. It has one of the highest rates of literacy in the world. Has more physicians per capita than 10 times as many physicians per capita as the United States. So that the Cuban youth, whether they're in high school or middle school, I've been to elementary schools, they're much more attuned with the world. And you know, they're passionate about their music. And so you do hear them tuning in to, a few years ago it was versions of Walkmans, now it's MP3. And now you see, in the past few years, every time I've gone, you see cell phones all over the place. And you see young people texting very much like they do here. And they are, I guess they're different of American young people in some important ways. I mentioned their level of education, their level of awareness of the world, but they're very much like our youth here.
Okay. President Obama recently visited Cuba. Do you think he's moving in the right direction by meeting with Cuban leaders, and do you think he intends to end the embargo? Or?
I think he has made some important moves. The United States policy towards Cuba had been frozen for nearly 60 years. And so Obama has attempted to make some changes, and in fact, he has alleviated the effects of the embargo. As I mentioned, he cannot undo the embargo by himself. So he has liberalized some of the regulations about trade. He has made it easier. It's amazing that Americans, we can travel to Syria, we can travel to North Korea, we can travel to Yemen in a state of war today, but we cannot travel freely to Cuba. But he has liberalized, Obama has liberalized the who can travel and for what to Cuba. You can still not go as a tourist, but you have to go on an educational trip. But he has made it easier for American companies to trade with Cuba. He has made it easy for United States company to bring internet to Cuba, for instance, and some important measures.
Okay.
But I'd like to note, he does that with one hand, and this is mid-April. At the end of March 31st, there was a request for proposals of the U.S. Agency for International Development that requested proposals from companies to come up with plans to continue to undermine the Cuban government. And you could get, I believe that the grants were up to $6 million to come up with plans to undermine the government. And these are processes, for instance, there was a campaign of disinformation last year. They have been training hip-hop dissenters to advocate against the government. So there are two hands to this policy.
And during Obama's visit to Cuba, there was a lot of talk in our media about human rights violations in Cuba. What's the state of human rights in Cuba?
Well, just before I came, because I wanted to get the information, I read the most recent report from Amnesty International. It's called the State of Human Rights in the World. And the most recent report talks about torture in Cuba only in Guantanamo Bay. The only torture detention without a trial that is happening in Cuba and that has happened in Cuba since 1959 is happening in Gitmo, the naval base that the United States has illegally occupied and continues to occupy. We know about the Abu Ghraib, we know about the abuses in Gitmo. Amnesty does talk about 5 prisoners of conscience in Cuba. I just wanted to make sure that I would find that. And so they actually named them. They say at the end of the year, this is 2015, 5 prisoners of conscience detained solely for peacefully exercising the right of freedom of expression remain in prison. And again, they name, and they had sentences of between 1 and 3 years in prison, which is still very different. You and I can name more than 5 prisoners of conscience in this country, and their sentences are much lengthier than that. I can think of the Puerto Rican Oscar Lopez, who's been in prison for 33 years. Is there, there was something I saw on CNN while Obama was there, of some dissenters that were detained by the police. But if you notice what was going on, these dissenters were occupying, interrupting traffic in the middle of a road, which, you know, activists here in this country do, and when we do that, it's called civil disobedience, and we are arrested, as these people were arrested. Every one of those that were arrested, as often happened, were released within hours. It's no nirvana, that's for sure. But I can truthfully say, and the Amnesty International report would support that, that in many ways there's much more freedom of dissent in Cuba than there is here.
I think some people would really be surprised.
Well, go to Amnesty International. It's an amazing report.
Okay.
Frankly, I was
Sounds good.
surprised too when I read only 5 prisoners of conscience at the end of the year, because I'm a consumer of news in this country, and I still can be as naive as I was when I entered the University of Puerto Rico at times.
We're down to about 3 minutes, so maybe you could very briefly address what benefit the embargo would have for the United States, if any, ending the embargo.
Well, I mentioned the isolation of the United States internationally, not only from the European Union and Canada, some of our strongest allies, but every South and Central American nation had told the United States they would not participate in the Summit of the Americas unless Cuba was a part of that. And that was, Cuban experts say that was what the prime motivation for Obama to begin to undo the embargo. So there's that political isolation. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been advocating for an end of the embargo. It talks about how American agricultural interests and industrial factories, the apples from our Mid-Hudson Valley, the dairy from our upstate New York, would have a natural trading partner in Cuba. It's only 90 miles away. And I believe that the testimony in Congress of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said that it would generate in the United States some 250,000 jobs the day that the embargo falls.
Now we're down to 2 minutes. So in 2 sentences, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the future of Cuba will be after the Castro brothers are gone? I know that's not much time.
Yes. Well, that's still to be determined. But I think that the current president is Raúl Castro. He's got a term limit. And he will no longer be in the position that he is in 2018. And I believe that there will be new leaders that have already been identified and are coming up the ranks. And I believe that it will continue to make progress. There have been very significant changes in the Cuban economy that we can talk at some other time. And Cuba continues to experiment with a more mixed economy. Some of the I went to some restaurants this time that in my previous trip just 2 years earlier were government owned, and now they're co-op of the workers. And this is happening all over Cuba. You go to auto shops, or you go to barber shops, and now there are co-ops. So there's a lot of change in Cuba, and it remains to be seen.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. I think we could do another whole show. We didn't get to half the questions I had for you. For people that would like to join you, we've got your Facebook page listed on the screen and your email address. But you would welcome more people in your organization, I would assume?
Oh, absolutely. We meet every second Wednesday of the month at 7:30 p.m. at the Friends Meeting House, which is on Madison Avenue. I think it's on the 400 block. But just look it up or drop us an email. We'd be glad to let you know. Again, every second Wednesday. We have activities every month, and we would certainly welcome all of you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Trudy.
Thank you for being here today. And thank you all for joining us. We'll have other shows in the future. We'll cover subjects such as the use of drones and the high cost of war. Thank you.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home, from the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home, from the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms.